My mom sold my childhood home behind my back, then I exposed her secret. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2019, while I was sitting in a parking lot outside a grocery store in Columbus, Ohio, eating a gas station sandwich because I'd skipped breakfast to make rent. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Is this Daniel Harmon? Yeah, who's this? My name is Patricia Wells. I'm a real estate attorney here in Maplewood. I'm calling because, well, I'm not entirely sure how to say this. Your childhood home, the property at 412 Birchwood Lane, it sold 3 weeks ago. Closed escrow on February 19th. I assumed you were aware. I wasn't aware. I sat in that parking lot for 22 minutes. I counted. The sandwich went cold in my hand. The heat in my car died because I'd stopped the engine to save gas, and outside it was 28 degrees, and I sat there completely still, not because I was calm, but because I genuinely did not know what to do with what I'd just heard. My mother had sold the house I grew up in. The house my father built with his own hands. The house where we scattered his ashes in the backyard garden on a gray November afternoon 11 years earlier. She sold it. Without telling me. Without a single word. And somehow, that wasn't even the worst part. Because what I would discover over the next 6 weeks, buried in county records, in a storage unit I wasn't supposed to find, in an envelope tucked inside a Bible, would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my family, my father, and the life we were supposedly living. Maplewood, Ohio is the kind of town that gets forgotten on purpose. Population, 6,200. One main road. A Dollar General where a hardware store used to be. A diner called the Copper Kettle that's been serving the same breakfast menu since 1987. If you drove through it on the highway, you'd blink twice and miss it entirely. Most people do. For 12, Birchwood Lane sat at the end of a gravel road that curved past a line of oak trees so old they'd grown into each other at the crown, forming a kind of tunnel in the summer, when the leaves were full. My father planted 2 of those oaks himself in 1991, the year I was born. He planted them 6 feet apart, one for him and one for me, and he used to joke that whichever one grew taller would win. His always won. The house was a 2-story white colonial with green shutters that peeled a little every winter and got repainted every spring. For bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a kitchen that smelled like coffee and would smoke, a back porch where my father kept his tools organized in a pegboard system he designed himself, labeled in his small, precise handwriting. The kind of handwriting that looked like it came from someone who believed words were worth the effort of making them look right. My father, Robert Harmon, was a structural engineer. Not the glamorous kind, not the kind who designed skyscrapers in glass towers. He was the kind who spent his career checking other people's math, reviewing load calculations, making sure bridges didn't fall down and buildings didn't sink. He worked 41 years for a small firm in Columbus and commuted 90 minutes round trip every single day. He retired in 2006 with a handshake, a card signed by 11 coworkers, and a lifetime of careful, thankless precision. He died of pancreatic cancer in November 2008, 62 years old. 4 months from diagnosis to gone. By March 2019, I hadn't been back to Birchwood Lane in 2 years. My mother and I had what you might charitably call a complicated relationship. We talked on the phone every few weeks, short conversations, nothing deep, the kind of calls where both people are managing distance rather than closing it. She never mentioned anything wrong. She never mentioned anything at all, really. Just weather and neighbors and a casserole she'd made, and whether I was eating enough. She never mentioned she was selling the house. And when I drove the 3 hours from Columbus to Maplewood the morning after Patricia Wells called me, pulling into that gravel road with its tunnel of oaks, I found a moving company's truck parked where my father's old Buick used to sit, and a family I'd never seen before carrying boxes through the front door. I pulled over on the side of the road and sat there with my hands on the wheel. The new family had a little girl, maybe 7 years old, with a yellow jacket. She ran across the front porch laughing at something her father said. And I watched that and felt something I couldn't quite name, not quite grief, not quite anger. Something older than both. I called my mother 12 times that afternoon. She answered on the 13th call, Somewhere around 4 p.m., while I was sitting at a booth in the copper kettle nursing a coffee I'd already let go cold. Daniel. Her voice was flat. Not surprised. Not apologetic. Just flat.
Mom.
You sold the house. A pause. Yes. Without telling me. It was my house, Daniel. Your father left it to me. And that was essentially the full extent of her explanation. She was staying with her sister in Dayton. She said she was fine. She said she needed to move on. She said the house was too big and too expensive and too full of things she couldn't carry anymore, and when I asked her why she hadn't said anything, hadn't even mentioned she was thinking about selling, she said, very quietly, because I knew you'd make it complicated. I drove home to Columbus that night in a kind of numb fury. I made the mistake of posting about it. Not the full story, just a fragment, a vague post on Facebook about family and grief, and not being told things that affect you. The kind of posts people make when they're hurt and want to feel heard without quite being vulnerable enough to explain why. The responses were exactly what you'd expect from the internet. My cousin Brenda, who I hadn't spoken to in 4 years, commented that Mom had every right to do whatever she wanted with her own property. My Aunt Linda shared a scripture about forgiveness. A guy I went to high school with, someone I'd barely known, left a comment saying I sounded like a child throwing a tantrum over something that was never mine to begin with. And you know what? On a surface level, they weren't entirely wrong. Legally, the house was my mother's. My father had left it to her, not to me. I had no claim, no standing, no legal right to be consulted. I was a 27-year-old man with a lease in Columbus and a job I didn't love and no particular reason to expect that I had any say in what happened to a piece of property I didn't own. But here's the thing nobody in those comments knew. Here's the thing I didn't even fully know yet at that moment, sitting in my apartment reading their responses at 11 o'clock at night. There was something wrong about that sale. Not emotionally wrong. Legally wrong. And the reason I knew, or suspected, had everything to do with a conversation I'd had with my father 12 years earlier, when I was 15 years old, and he sat me down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil and said, "Dan, I want to show you something about this house. Let me tell you who I was in March 2019 so you understand how unlikely all of this was. I was not a lawyer. I was not a real estate professional. I had a bachelor's degree in communications from Ohio State that I'd finished in 5 years instead of 4, because I changed my major twice and failed an accounting class the first time I took it. I worked in digital marketing for a mid-sized company that made industrial packaging, not exactly the kind of career that prepares you for uncovering hidden property transactions. I drove a 2011 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it. I had $1,800 in savings. I ate a lot of pasta. People who knew me would have described me as someone who was fine. Not exceptional. Not struggling exactly, but not thriving either. The kind of person who moves through life in the middle lane, adequate, unremarkable, reliably present without being particularly memorable. I had a girlfriend named Sophie, who was kind and patient and probably too good for me, who worked as a pediatric nurse and made better decisions than I did. She was the first person I called after my mother, and she said, "What do you actually want from this, Dan?" And I didn't have an answer, which was sort of a summary of my life at that point. But here's the thing about being fine. People underestimate you. They look at you, and they see someone manageable. Someone who can be handled. Someone who will take the news quietly and eventually come around and get over it the way reasonable people are supposed to get over things. My mother knew I was fine. She was counting on it. What she didn't know, what nobody knew really, including me, was that I was my father's son in a way that had never quite surfaced yet. My father was a structural engineer. His whole life was about finding what was wrong before it failed. Checking the math, reading the documents, looking at what everyone else accepted and asking, does this actually hold? I'd inherited that instinct without ever having the occasion to use it. Until now. And what the internet commenters and my Aunt Linda and my cousin Brenda did not realize was that I wasn't upset about losing a house. I was upset because something about that sale felt structurally wrong. And my father had taught me, in that kitchen with that piece of paper and pencil, exactly what to look for. My father was 52 years old when he sat me down at the kitchen table in September 2007. I was 15. It was a Sunday afternoon in early fall, one of those Ohio days where the light comes in golden through the kitchen window and the whole world feels unhurried. He had a yellow legal pad, a mechanical pencil, and 2 cups of coffee, one for him, one he made for me even though I was 15, which felt like being welcomed into something. He said he wanted to teach me about the house, not how to paint it or fix the gutters. The paperwork side, the hidden architecture of ownership. He explained that when he and my mother bought 412 Birchwood Lane in 1989, they'd taken out a 30-year mortgage. But in 1997, when he'd gotten a small inheritance from his own father, he'd done something unusual. He had the property deed modified to include what he called a right of first refusal clause, a provision that said if the property was ever sold, their son, meaning me, had the legal right to match any outside offer before the sale could be finalized to a third party. He wrote this down in his small, careful handwriting on the yellow legal pad. He explained what each word meant. He drew a small diagram with boxes and arrows showing how property ownership worked, how deeds functioned, how modifications to deeds had to be recorded with the county. He was patient and thorough, and it took almost 2 hours. At the time, I was 15. I found it mildly interesting and then completely forgot about it for 12 years. But memory is a strange thing. It stores what you think you've lost. And sitting in my Columbus apartment at 11 p.m. reading my Aunt Linda's scripture about forgiveness, something from that kitchen table rose up through 12 years of ordinary life and stopped me cold. The right of first refusal. If my father had filed that clause, recorded it properly with the Cuyahoga County Recorder's Office, or in this case, Maplewoods County, which was Ridgway County, then my mother couldn't legally sell that house without notifying me first, without giving me the chance to match the offer, which she absolutely, definitively did not do. I got up and walked to my kitchen and stood at the window for a long time looking at the parking lot below. Now, here's what I need to tell you about my father's professional habits. 41 years as a structural engineer who checked other people's math. A man who labeled his tools. A man who, when he retired, organized 11 file cabinets full of project documents into a system so thorough that his firm sent him a letter 2 years after he left saying they were still using his filing methodology as their standard. If Robert Harmon had that clause added to a deed, it was recorded. It was filed. It was documented in triplicate somewhere, and there was a copy in a folder with a label, and that folder was in a cabinet or a box or a storage unit somewhere on this earth. The question was where? Because when he died in 2008, I was 16 years old. My mother handled everything. And at 16, grieving and overwhelmed, I hadn't thought about yellow legal pads and right of first refusal clauses. I'd thought about how the kitchen didn't smell the same anymore. 11 years later, I was thinking about them now. The first obstacle was simple. I needed to find the deed. Ridgway County had an online property records portal, the kind that's technically public but practically designed to be unusable. The interface looked like it was built in 2003 and never updated. There was a search function, but it required either a parcel number or an exact owner name, and when I typed in Harmon for the current records, it returned the new owners, a couple named Greg and Melissa Forsyth. Purchase recorded February 19, 2019, sale price $218,000. I stared at that number for a long time. $218,000. In 2019, for a 4-bedroom colonial on a half-acre lot with mature trees and a good school district, that was low. Not drastically low, but noticeably low. The kind of number that made you wonder if someone had been in a hurry, or if someone had needed the money fast. To access the older deed records, the 1997 modification my father had described, I would need to either visit the Ridgway County Recorder's Office in person or request certified copies through the mail. The mail option took 4 to 6 weeks. I drove to Maplewood the following Saturday. The recorder's office was in a beige government building on Elm Street, the kind of building that exists in every county seat in America, slightly too warm inside, industrial carpet, fluorescent lighting, a counter staffed by 2 people who were both genuinely trying to help and fundamentally limited in what they could do quickly. I explained that I needed the deed history for 412 Birchwood Lane going back to 1989. The clerk, a woman named Diane who had bifocals on a beaded chain and an expression of permanent patience, typed slowly and frowned at her screen. She said the records went back to 1992 digitally, but anything before that was microfiche. She said the 1997 records should be accessible. She printed me 4 pages and handed them across the counter in a manila folder. I sat in the parking lot and opened the folder. The original 1989 deed was there. The 1992 refinancing was there. The 2009 probate transfer, my mother taking sole ownership after my father's death, was there. The 1997 modification was not there. I went back inside and asked Diane if there could be supplemental filings attached to the original deed, rider documents, amendments, attached provisions. She said yes, technically, but they would need to be requested separately by document type, and the system didn't make that easy. She handed me a request form with 11 fields. I filled it out and left it with her and drove back to Columbus. 3 weeks passed. The form came back with a note: no supplemental filings on record for that parcel, which meant one of 3 things. Either my father had never actually filed the clause, had only written it on a yellow legal pad, and never followed through, or it had been filed under a different parcel designation, or it had been removed at some point. That third option was the one that kept me up at night, because a recorded deed modification doesn't just disappear. Someone has to file to remove it. Someone has to sign documents. Someone has to go to the county recorder's office and make a legal request. And if that had happened, if someone had quietly removed a clause from a deed before selling a house, that wasn't just a family disagreement. That was fraud. I almost stopped there. I want to be honest about that. I almost convinced myself that my father had simply never filed the clause, that it was a Sunday afternoon conversation, the kind of thing a father says to a teenage son to feel like he's passing something down, and that reality was simpler than my suspicion. Sophie told me gently that I should probably consider the possibility that I was looking for a conspiracy because grief felt better when it had a target. That was a fair thing to say. She wasn't wrong to say it. But then I found the storage unit. My father had rented a 10 by 10 climate-controlled storage unit at Ridgeway Self-Storage on Route 9 since 1995. I knew this because I found a bank statement in a shoebox in my own closet, a shoebox of random papers my mother had given me when she moved out of the house in 2010, 2 years after my father died, when she'd briefly moved in with her sister before eventually going back to Birchwood Lane. I'd never opened the box. I'd moved it from apartment to apartment for 9 years without opening it. The bank statement was from April 2007 and showed a recurring charge, $54 per month, Ridgeway Self-Storage, Unit 14. I called the storage facility on a Thursday in April 2019. A man named Terry answered. I explained I believed my late father had rented a unit there, and I was trying to access it. Terry said the unit was still active, paid monthly through an automatic bank draft under the name Robert Harmon. Still active. Still paid. 11 years after my father died. I drove to Maplewood the next morning. Unit 14 was in the back row of the facility, a beige metal door with a padlock. I had no key, but Terry, bless his straightforward decency, looked up the account and told me that in 2009, a second authorized name had been added, Daniel Harmon. My father had added my name to the storage unit account the year after I was born. No, wait. Terry corrected himself. The account update was dated October 2008. 1 month before my father died. He had added my name to that account 1 month before he died. And then he apparently told no one. And the unit had sat there for 11 years, quietly paid by a bank account that I would later discover my father had funded with a small certificate of deposit that auto-renewed every year, precisely enough to cover the storage fees until I was old enough to think to look. My father had planned for me to find it. He just couldn't tell me where to look without telling me why. Terry gave me a bolt cutter for the padlock, said it happened all the time with long-term units, and walked me back to row C. The door rolled up with a sound like a slow exhale. The unit was immaculate. Of course it was. This was my father's storage unit. Every box was labeled in his small, careful handwriting. Every box was sealed with brown packing tape applied in precise straight lines. There was a folding table set up along the right wall with a green lamp on it, unplugged, and a wooden chair placed at exactly the right angle, as if someone had arranged it for a person who was about to sit down and read. I stood in the doorway for almost a full minute before I stepped inside. The boxes were organized by category: property, finance, engineering, personal. I went straight to the box labeled property. Inside were 11 folders, each labeled with a year. I went to the 1997 folder first. It was there. The deed modification was there. Certified copy, stamped by the Ridgeway County Recorder's Office on March 14, 1997. Complete with the right of first refusal clause, written in legal language my father had clearly worked on carefully, probably with a real estate attorney, probably the same firm that had handled the original purchase. The clause was ironclad. It stated that in the event of any voluntary sale of the property at 412 Birchwood Lane, the named beneficiary, Daniel Robert Harmon, must be notified in writing no fewer than 30 days prior to any accepted offer and must be given the opportunity to match any bona fide third-party offer at the stated sale price within that 30-day window. I sat in that folding chair with the document in my hands and felt something shift. Then I opened the 2006 folder. There was a letter in there from a law firm in Columbus, a firm I'll call Whitmore and Associates, because they're still in operation and I'm not interested in litigation. The letter was addressed to my father and dated September 12, 2006. It referenced a request to modify or remove the right of first refusal rider from the 412 Birchwood Lane deed. My father's response was handwritten in the margin of the letter, in red pen, in letters larger than his usual small, careful script. It said, "Declined. Do not proceed." Someone in 2006, 2 years before my father died, had tried to get him to remove that clause. He had refused. I sat with that for a long time. Then I started going through the other folders. The finance box took me 3 hours. I found bank statements, insurance policies, a Second Life insurance policy I had never known about, and something that made my stomach drop, a series of loan documents showing that in 2013, for years after my father died, 5 years before the house sale, my mother had refinanced the Birchwood Lane property and taken out a $40,000 home equity line of credit. Then in 2016, another $35,000 equity draw. Then in early 2018, a third draw of $22,000. The house had been worth approximately $195,000 in 2013. By the time she sold it in February 2019 for $218,000, after real estate fees and the outstanding balances on 3 equity draws totaling almost $100,000, the actual net proceeds from that sale were somewhere around $90,000. My mother needed that money. She needed it badly, and she'd been pulling equity for 6 years, and when she finally sold the house, she needed it to close fast, without complications, without a 30-day window where her son might appear with a matching offer and the legal right to buy a property she was liquidating to survive. That was the secret. Not malice, not hatred, just desperation and silence, and a mother who could not bring herself to tell her son that she was drowning. I did not call my mother that night. I drove back to Columbus, went to my apartment, and sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning going through photographs I'd taken of every document in that storage unit. Sophie called at 10:30 and I let it go to voicemail, which I'd never done before. I needed to think without having to explain what I was thinking. The next morning I called a real estate attorney in Columbus. Not to sue my mother. I want to be clear about that because this story could easily read as a vengeance story, and it wasn't. I called an attorney because I needed to understand what the documents actually meant, legally, technically, specifically, before I did anything at all. The attorney's name was Janet Osei. She had an office in a building downtown and she charged $300 an hour, and she was precise in the way my father was precise, which made me trust her immediately. I gave her photocopies of everything: the 1997 deed rider, the Whitmore letter, the equity draw documents, the sale record. She read everything twice. Then she put the papers down on her desk and looked at me. "The right of first refusal is valid," she said. "It's recorded, it was never legally removed, and it was never superseded by the probate transfer in 2009. In fact, the probate transfer should have flagged this encumbrance. The fact that it didn't, and that the sale proceeded in February without your notification, that's a significant oversight at best." "At best," I repeated. She nodded slowly. "At best." I asked what my options were. She outlined them carefully. I could pursue a legal challenge to the sale, which was unlikely to succeed in reversing the transfer to the Forsyth family, who were bona fide purchasers with no knowledge of the encumbrance. I could pursue a civil claim against my mother for damages. I could pursue a claim against the title company that had issued the closing policy without flagging the writer. I told her I needed to think about it. She said, "Before you do anything, go talk to your mother." I drove to Dayton on a Saturday in May 2019. My Aunt Linda's house was a split level in a suburb called Kettering, beige siding, careful garden, a ceramic goose on the front step that changed outfits with the seasons. My mother was sitting on the back patio when Linda let me in, and when she saw me through the sliding glass door, something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, more like relief. The relief of someone who has been waiting for a difficult thing to arrive and is finally tired of waiting. I sat down across from her. I put the documents on the patio table between us. She looked at them for a long time without touching them. "You found the storage unit," she said. "Yeah, Mom." She nodded. She was 68 years old, and she looked tired in a way that I hadn't noticed before because I hadn't been looking closely enough. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something alone for too long. She told me the whole story. She'd made some investments after my father died, her own attempt at financial independence, at rebuilding a life after 40 years of a shared one. The investments had failed. Nothing dramatic, no scandal, just ordinary bad luck with a financial advisor who'd talked her into products she didn't understand. By 2013, she was drawing on the equity in a house to cover her living expenses. She'd told herself each time that it was temporary, that she'd figure something out, that things would turn around. They didn't turn around. By 2018, she was behind on the equity line payments. The bank had sent her a notice. She had a friend, a man named Gary from her church, who knew a real estate agent who could move the house quietly and quickly. She'd taken the offer. "I knew about the deed writer," she said. "I'd known since the 1990s. When I needed to sell, I went to an attorney to find out if it could be removed." She paused. "That was 2006. Your father was still alive. He wouldn't do it." "I know," I said. "I saw the letter. When he died, I thought it had just gone away with him. I thought maybe it wouldn't matter. I told the title company it was outdated and had been verbally rescinded. They should have caught it. They didn't." She looked at me then, directly, and her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I couldn't tell you I'd lost everything. I couldn't tell you that I'd done it to myself. I couldn't sit across from you and say I had squandered what your father spent 41 years building. There were no villains in this story. There was just a woman who was ashamed and a dead man's documents and 11 years of a storage unit waiting to be opened. I want to tell you what happened with my cousin Brenda and my Aunt Linda and the Facebook comment about property rights and tantrums. Nothing dramatic. Life isn't a courtroom. People don't often issue formal apologies for being dismissive on the internet. But I called Janet Osei the Monday after I sat with my mother on that back patio. I told her I didn't want to pursue any legal action against my mother. I did, however, want to pursue the title company, the firm that had issued the closing insurance policy on 412 Birchwood Lane without properly clearing the deed encumbrance my father had recorded in 1997. Janet said that was reasonable. She said the title company had a clear professional obligation to identify recorded writers on a deed, and that their failure to do so had directly resulted in my loss of my legal right of first refusal. We filed a claim in June 2019. The title company's attorney initially responded with the kind of letter that's designed to make you feel like you're wrong before you've even begun. They argued the writer was outdated, that it predated the probate transfer, that my mother's verbal representations to the closing agent constituted sufficient disclosure. Janet responded point by point. Here's what the title company's attorney probably didn't account for. My father had spent 41 years making sure his documentation was bulletproof. The 1997 writer wasn't a photocopy. It was a certified original. It had been notarized, witnessed, and recorded by 2 separate county offices. There was a cross-reference filing in the 2002 refinancing documents. My father had, essentially, built a structural case that could hold weight long after he was gone. The settlement came in October 2019. I can't share the specific number under the terms of the agreement, but I'll tell you it was enough to address the outstanding equity debt on the property, with enough left over to change my circumstances meaningfully. My cousin Brenda never commented again. My Aunt Linda called to say she'd been praying for me, which I accepted genuinely. By the end of 2019, my mother's equity debts were cleared. I want to say that simply because the complicated version of this story, the version where I was righteous and she was wrong and I won and she lost, is not the one I'm living. The one I'm living is that she was a 68-year-old widow who had made mistakes and hidden them out of shame, and I was her son, and the documents in a storage unit gave me the ability to fix something that had gone badly wrong. We started talking more after that. Real conversations, not the managed distances of before. She told me things about her marriage that I hadn't known, not bad things, just human things. The compromises and the silences and the particular loneliness of being the partner of someone very good who is also very focused. My father loved her. He also spent 41 years checking other people's math and came home tired, and there are things that don't get said in those marriages that should probably be said. In 2020, I left the marketing job. I'd been using the settlement period to educate myself, studying property law, reading about deed structures, researching how often title issues slip through the cracks in residential real estate transactions. The answer, it turned out, was more often than anyone wanted to admit. I got a paralegal certification in 2021 and began working with a small firm in Columbus that specialized in real estate law. I was not a lawyer. I was, in the words of the supervising attorney, the most practically knowledgeable non-lawyer he'd worked with, which I took as the highest compliment I'd ever received. I spent my days doing exactly what my father had spent his doing, checking the math, looking at what everyone had assumed was fine, and asking whether it actually was. In 2022, I helped a family in Westerville, Ohio, a Black family who had purchased a property through an estate sale and then discovered an undisclosed easement that restricted their ability to use 2/3 of their backyard. Their real estate agent had missed it. Their title company had missed it. They had been living with it for 18 months before a neighbor mentioned it casually over the fence. We found the original easement document filed in 1968. We filed a claim. The title company settled. By 2023, we had handled 41 similar cases in 2 years. 41 families who had been sold properties with hidden encumbrances, outdated restrictions, improperly cleared liens, or documentation errors that had survived through probate transfers and multiple sales cycles entirely undetected. The cases ranged from small nuisances to situations where families had lost meaningful property rights without ever knowing they had them. My father checked other people's math for 41 years. I appear to be following the same career arc, just with a different set of documents. In September 2023, my mother came to visit me in Columbus. She stayed for 5 days, which was the longest visit we'd had in probably 15 years. We made dinner every night and I showed her the office and she sat at one of the desks and looked at the filing system I'd set up, the labeled folders, the cross-referenced document archive, the color-coded case tracking system, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That looks like your father's office." I hadn't thought about that, but she was right. She told me, on the last night of her visit, that she'd found something in a shoebox she'd kept from the Birchwood Lane house, a box of small items she couldn't bring herself to give away. Inside was a handwritten note from my father, dated October 2008, the same month he'd added my name to the storage unit account. It said, simply, "Dan will figure it out. He just needs time and a reason." She handed me the note, folded and soft at the creases. I've kept it in my wallet since then. There is a particular kind of person, and I suspect you know someone like this, maybe you are someone like this who does not announce what they're building, who works quietly and precisely and trusts that the structure will be discovered when the right person looks hard enough. My father was that kind of person. He didn't tell me about the storage unit. He didn't send a dramatic letter. He just made sure the documentation was right, added my name to an account, and trusted time. I think about that a lot in this work. The families we help are not dramatic stories, most of the time. They're just people who bought a house and got something wrong slipped in beneath the paperwork, and they need someone who knows how to look. My father spent 41 years being that person for bridges and buildings. I'm spending my years being that person for families. Here's what I know now that I didn't know in that parking lot in March 2019, eating a gas station sandwich in the cold. The thing that saves you is almost never the thing that looks like saving. It's usually something old, something quiet, something your father wrote on a yellow legal pad on a Sunday afternoon when you were 15 and too young to understand why it mattered. We live in a world that rewards the visible, the announcement, the dramatic gesture, the loud declaration of intent. But the real work, the structural work, the work that holds weight through decades and grief and financial collapse and family silence and all the ordinary disasters of a life, that work is almost always invisible until the moment you need it. My father never told me he'd built me a safety net. He just built it. He recorded the documents, funded the storage unit, added my name, and trusted that I would eventually become someone who would look. The question that stays with me is not whether I was smart enough to find it. It's whether I'll be patient enough to build something similar for whoever comes after me. Something real. Something recorded. Something that holds. Because the most powerful things don't announce themselves. They just wait, quietly and precisely, for someone with enough reason to finally go looking.